Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. There's an old rule in diplomacy that claims that war makes strange bedfellows. It's the idea that during a time of conflict, alliances make sense, but once the conflict is over, those alliances might break down. After World War II, the conflict was over, but suddenly the Allies enter a new phase of conflict, the Cold War. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify the events and ideological conflicts that prompted the Cold War. And you should be able to explain the major initiatives of Truman's domestic policies. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. Here are the two powers that emerged from World War II. The two greatest powers on Earth after World War II was the Soviet Union and the United States. And the Soviet Union really could rival the United States, but you never could eclipse. Both countries had a deep distrust of each other. The United States didn't trust the Soviet Union because for a few reasons, not the least of which is that Stalin had ties with Hitler before joining the Allies and really only changed sides when the Nazis had turned on the Soviets. And the Soviets had resented the Western Allies for not fighting Germany faster when the Nazis attacked Russia, and that the United States kept the atomic bomb a secret. In defense, we also kept it secret from people in our own government. I mean, Truman didn't know there was an atomic bomb until he became president. There was a strong ideological difference, though, that remains between capitalism, like an American model, and communism, like the Soviets were using. Capitalism gives people the power to start businesses and get rich or get poor, while communism tries to protect workers by owning all of the industry for themselves. They are incompatible worldviews, and really it seems inevitable that they were going to conflict. Subpoint B. It seems those two inevitable powers emerging from the world would eventually clash at some level. Americans viewed the Soviets' installation of communist governments in Eastern European nations as oppressive moves, while the Soviets compared it to the British Empire and America's role in Latin America. In 1946, the American diplomat George Kennan sent the long telegram from Moscow to the Truman administration saying that communist countries just couldn't be dealt with like other governments. Their desire to spread communism was a powerful force, and it needed to be opposed by another powerful force, in this case, the United States. The long telegram argued that capitalism was a menace to the ideas of socialism and that capitalists could not be trusted or allowed to influence the Soviet people. The long telegram became the reason the United States pursued a containment policy, where the United States would be committed to preventing further expansion of communism. In March of and I want you to remember that term, containment. It means that we didn't want communism to spread. In March of 1945, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri. By this point, he's no longer the Prime Minister. He's been voted out of government. But he's in, the heartland. He's in Fulton, Missouri, near St. Louis. And he gives a speech there where he uses this phrase that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, separating the free West from the communist East. Truman soon determined to put the policy of containment into effect. To rally popular backing for Greece and Turkey, Truman rolled out the heaviest weapon in his rhetorical arsenal, the defense of freedom. The Truman Doctrine had affected how Americans understood the post-war world. People believed that the United States had now a permanent global responsibility. This is a shift from most of American history, which is fairly isolationist. By World War II, the tide has turned, and the United States is going to be inextricably entwined in everybody's business from here on out. Subpoint C. 2 years after World War II was over, much of Europe was still laying in ruins. There was food shortages, inflation, economic chaos. It was all made worse by an unusually cold winter in 1946 to 47. The poverty and destruction of post-war Europe made it fertile ground for the spread of communism. Having learned the lesson that fragile governments after World War I couldn't hold up to stress, the United States wanted to make sure that these new democratic countries could succeed after this Second World War. And to shore up those governments, the United States offered massive aid to struggling countries in the form of food and money. Secretary of State George Marshall pledged the United States was going to contribute billions of dollars to the economic recovery of Europe. He promised that it was a purely humanitarian effort. His line was that our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free countries, free institutions can exist. Now, Stalin insisted that Eastern European countries should refuse American aid and instead take Soviet aid. The Molotov Plan was an alternative to the Soviet Union's communist neighbors. In June of 1948, Stalin tried to push the Western Allies out of Germany altogether by blocking West Germany's rails, roads, and canals. They cut off road and rail traffic from the American, British, and French zones of occupied Germany into the city of Berlin. The goal was to force West Germany into accepting Soviet aid by starving the West for food and fuel. But the United States responded with the Berlin airlift to go and fly more than 200,000 flights into West Germany, dropping 4,700 tons of food and fuel to desperate Berliners. By spring of 1949, they were dropping actually more supplies than ever came by rail, making Stalin's blockade pretty worthless. Stalin had to lift the blockade in May of 1949, but both sides remained hostile to each other. But on the contrast, the Marshall Plan offered a positive view to go along with the model of containment. It envisioned a new deal for Europe. It proved to be one of the most successful foreign aid programs in history. Subpoint D. General Douglas MacArthur was named the Supreme Commander of Japan until 1948, when Japan had adopted its new democratic constitution that renounced war forever. Largely written by MacArthur and drawing heavily on the United States Constitution as its model, Japan today knows it as the MacArthur Constitution. The U.S. also oversaw economic reconstruction of Japan. The United States initially proposed to dissolve Japanese industry, but decided that a strong Japan would protect against communist expansion in Asia. Subpoint E. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and 9 Western European countries formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, and that was to assist each other if they were ever attacked. That same year, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. And also in 1949, the communist leader Mao Zedong successfully drove Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government out of China. Chinese communism seemed like a huge setback to the containment policy, and the U.S. government refused to acknowledge its legitimacy until the 1970s, when President Richard Nixon negotiated normalized, peaceful relations. In 1955, the Soviet Union and 7 satellite countries in Eastern Europe similarly pledged the Warsaw Pact in response to NATO. The Warsaw Pact had 2 purposes. It was a military alliance, and it was a way for the Soviet Union to exert its influence over its smaller neighbors. Subpoint F. Here we talk about the topic of the Korean War, sometimes considered one of the forgotten wars in American history. The Empire of Korea had been invaded by Japan in 1910 and was ruled over by Japan really until the end of World War II. At the end of that war, the Japanese troops surrendered to the Soviet Union, at least in the north part of the Korean peninsula. They surrendered to the Soviet Union. In the southern part, there, Japanese troops surrendered to United States troops. Remember, both the Soviet Union and the United States were allies during World War II, so this is surrendering to the Allies. And each side, the America and the Soviet Union, set up a temporary government to go rule over the territory, essentially until Korea could go rule itself again. The Soviets set up a communist government, no surprise, and the United States set up a democratic capitalist one, no surprise there either. The country was divided at roughly the 38th degree line of latitude, 38th degree north line of latitude. You'll also hear it called the 38th parallel in 1945. In June of 1950, the North Korean army ended up invading the South, hoping to reunify the country under now communist control. Communist China, and to a lesser extent the Soviets, supported North Korea, and United States troops were sent in to bolster South Korea to keep the whole country from falling. General MacArthur set up a brilliant amphibious attack behind enemy lines in the north, and the United States nearly won the war in fall of 1950. But MacArthur badly underestimated Chinese intervention, and he was caught completely off guard by a Chinese advance in November of 1950. And that pushed MacArthur onto a retreat position. And while he was retreating, he asked Truman for massive retaliation, basically saying that to go and and to secure North Korea and to push the Chinese entirely out of the peninsula, the war had to be taken to China itself. And it should be an atomic war using nuclear weapons onto the mainland of China. President Truman refused, saying that that would trigger a World War III, and we just couldn't do that again. America had suffered too much during World War II. MacArthur went public about his complaints, though, appealing to the United States press and to the Republican congressmen to go put pressure on Truman and force a conflict. The president said, well, a general in the Army responds to the commander-in-chief of the Army, and that MacArthur doesn't make this policy. The president makes this policy. And so President Truman fired MacArthur, fired him for subordination. The Korean War settled into a stalemate. Armistice was signed in 1943, but North and South Korea have never actually reached a peace treaty, so technically the war is still going on. Occasionally it flares up, but it's never really exploded into what we think of as a Korean War again. 33,000 Americans and roughly 3 million Koreans died in the fighting of the Korean War. Roman numeral number 2. Here I want to take a little bit and talk about Truman's presidency in a variety of ways, but let's begin first with the cultural Cold War. National security agencies encouraged Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies and to remove unpleasant parts of American history, such as Indian removal and racial discrimination, and just don't focus on those when you're talking about American history. The Soviet Union had world-famous ballet companies and dance troupes and symphony orchestra. By contrast, America in the 1940s and the 1950s was really pretty much a cultural backwater. The CIA became a patron of the art. The Central Intelligence Agency, in charge of spying on other countries, ended up promoting arts in the United States as a response to communist expansion. Particularly styles of art that were rejected by the communists, modern art and abstract art. And that was really to show that the United States artists had the freedom of intellectual and artistic expression that wouldn't be found in the Soviet Union. The CIA helped fund the Modern Museum of Art in New York City. In particular, the agency also promoted abstract expressionism, including artists like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning and Mark Rothko. Subpoint B. Here I want to talk about Truman's economic policies, and it's a little bit different. Truman's first domestic task was to preside over the difficult transition from wartime to peacetime. You see, 12 million men were coming home from the war, and pretty much all at once, and they were ready to go take jobs and go find work stateside. The armed forces was reduced to roughly 3 million servicemen within a year. And that was pretty traumatic to Americans, both economically and societally. The divorce rate had flat doubled from its pre-war era. The government had also been abolishing the wartime agencies, which were regulating the economy, and consumer prices, long pent-up demand, suddenly rose dramatically as labor protections were ending. So you have a kind of a bad situation where it looks like inflation and prices are going to shoot through the roof, but also you've got a real unemployment problem on your hands. The GI Bill of Rights had been established during World War I and had a major impact on post-war America. After World War II, we find the GI Bill of Rights really hits its most important stride because by 1946, over 1 million veterans were attending college. Basically, half of college enrollment were military veterans. Almost 4 million families received home mortgages, driving the suburban building boom. Truman was trying to expand New Deal protections, and later it was called the Truman's Fair Deal. Now, this is a little complicated. You had with Teddy Roosevelt the Square Deal. With Franklin Roosevelt, you had the New Deal. And now with Harry Truman, you have the Fair Deal. It's a lot of deals. The 1946 midterm election was strongly Republican, with middle-class Americans voting Republican because of labor problems, all those labor unions with their pent-up strife from during the war. They weren't really allowed to strike. And so they just had to accept the working conditions they were given. But once the war is over, the restrictions on labor are lifted, and there's a lot of striking that goes on. Basically, you have labor problems and working class Democrats basically not voting because Truman didn't show good support for unions during his time. The Republicans ended up winning both houses of Congress and largely rejected a lot of Truman's Fair Deal proposals. Subpoint C. In the years after World War II, a number of states took serious steps to address racial discrimination, particularly in some of the most important fields like employment and housing and public accommodations. This was partially in response to Hitler's rhetoric about a master race, and partly because of increased black militancy, which had demanded greater rights. Law enforcement agencies took racial crimes pretty seriously, and in 1952, for the first time since records were kept, there were no lynchings in the United States. 1952. The surest signs that times were changing, the 1947 Brooklyn Dodgers added Jackie Robinson to their team. Robinson's personal character, his promise and uses of nonviolence, and his really unquestionable talent, it challenged the traditional basis of segregation that marked so much of American life. In 1948, Truman presented an ambitious civil rights program to Congress, calling for a permanent civil rights commission and national laws against lynching and the poll tax and laws for equal access to jobs and education. Congress rejected them all. That same year, Truman issued an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. Subpoint D. Here I want to talk about the 1948 election because Truman's up for re-election and it's not going to be easy. It appears that public opinion is turning against him. The Democratic Party was sharply divided on racial issues. Northern Democrats insisted that states' rights arguments coming out of the southern wing of the party were just cover for human rights violations. And they pushed that the 1948 Democratic platform should be the most racially progressive in the party's history. On the other hand, Southern Democrats, often known as the Dixiecrats, refused to take part, feeling like they were getting pushed around by their, people in their same party, but just in a different part of the country. So they actually staged a walkout of the convention, of the Democratic National Convention in 1948, and instead formed a new rival political party known as the States' Rights Democratic Party. There, they nominated a different candidate for president. They nominated South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond claimed that Truman's plan to bring federal power into the South to go enforce civil rights protections wasn't all that different from Nazis in use of fascism and a strong government throwing its weight around over the power of the individual. That same year, a progressive wing from the Democratic Party split when former Vice President Henry Wallace ran for president, opposed to Truman's policy of containment. Henry Wallace had for a time been Franklin Roosevelt's vice president before Truman was named to the job. They were rivals in politics. Here, he said that the Soviet Union, Wallace said, shouldn't be contained, but should be engaged. We should go deal seriously with the countries that threaten us, to go build economic ties between the two countries. Democrats, though, were skeptical of this by and large and claimed that a vote for Wallace was like voting for Stalin. Truman campaigned on a promise of don't let them take away Social Security, a tactic that members of both political parties would basically repeat for years, and claiming that the legislature was a do-nothing Congress. Truman's main opponent that year, though, wasn't his own political rivals. He emerged as the winner of the Democratic National Convention. His main opponent was the Republican, Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey was kind of an uninteresting candidate, a boring, moderate Republican from New York. He was considered to be the safe candidate in the election. The Americans were eager to resettle into life, and they strongly supported Dewey. Most polls saw him easily defeating Truman, so much so that they actually quit polling a few weeks before the election. Though Wallace, right, so Henry Wallace, the Democrat, finished with 0 states. Strom Thurmond only won 39 electoral votes, but Truman ended up winning that election in 1948, and it was an upset victory over Dewey, and it's one of the most famous upsets in electoral history. This question of how the political parties are going to change are going to deal with a changing world and an emerging conflict between East and West in the Cold War and racial tensions and political uncertainty, all of these things are going to break out in 100 different ways. It's a fascinating story. I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.